Welcome to the She's Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Hi, folks. Boy, I really appreciate you joining me today. I know that we are all distracted with so much going on right now. And, I don't know, perhaps this is your distraction. In any case, thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. This is where you'll hear one-on-one conversations with women who have inspirational stories to share. These ladies are building businesses, stretching themselves beyond their comfort levels, breaking new ground in their fields, and basically making their own way through the world by forging new paths. I certainly find inspiration in every one of these conversations, and I hope you do too. Now, under normal circumstances, I record in person, but I haven't done that in months. And today's episode is one of the very last ones I recorded in person before everything shut down here in Washington State. It actually might be the very last one. As a matter of fact, today's guest was in town visiting from Alaska for a series of promotional events for her book, and these events ended up getting canceled at the last minute. So I feel really fortunate that she was here in Seattle and able to chat with me. Today's guest is Caroline Van Hemert. Caroline's new book is The Sun is a Compass, and it chronicles her and her husband's 4,000-mile, 6-month journey, and it was all human-powered from the coast of Washington State north to the Arctic coast. But her book isn't just an adventure travel memoir. Caroline is a wildlife biologist, so she's not just writing about her adventure of rowing, skiing, hiking, and canoeing. Her observations and what she writes about are very scientific, and it brings very much an environmental perspective. Now, as you listen to her describe this journey, I think it will leave you longing for doing something as remote and adventurous as this. Maybe it's just me, but certainly she has me wanting to just go away for 6 months and come out the other side of this pandemic with everything intact. And I know that isn't realistic, but certainly I can dream, right? I know you're really going to enjoy this podcast. And if so, do me a solid, please. If you'd like to show your support, you can do so with a donation through Patreon. By becoming part of our community, you'll have access to bonus content, which is usually in the form of a question I ask guests. Now, in Caroline's case, I asked her to describe a time that, I guess maybe wasn't so rosy between she and her husband. So she goes into some detail about that. As a Patreon supporter, you'll also get a heads up about what guests are coming up, and you'll have the ability to get your questions answered by that guest. You'll also be invited to join our private Facebook group, and that is ladies only. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/bebold. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, you can do that too via Venmo or PayPal, and that information is all on the Patreon page. Okay, with that, please enjoy this conversation with Caroline Van Hemert. So tell me, what did bring you down to Seattle just for these couple of days?
I'm doing a few events in the Pacific Northwest and got to see my brother and sister-in-law, and they have a new little girl. So
great.
Meet the baby as well.
How old is the baby?
Just over 2 weeks.
Oh my gosh. Oh, the timing was perfect.
Yeah.
To come down and do these events. So you were at REI last night. Are you actually doing an event in Olympia tonight?
I am.
Oh, you're actually speaking tonight.
Yeah,
oh, yeah. We'll make sure we do
REI
get you.
And one tomorrow, the following day in Portland. So
okay, great. Well, I'll definitely make sure you get out of here on time. It's not just like a dinner that you can show up for a couple minutes
I need
late,
to be. Yeah,
right?
I'm going to go meet a friend before and then go there.
Yeah, fantastic.
Event, so.
Do you get nervous before events like this?
Less so than I used to. I'm not a public speaker or performative person by nature, but I definitely am more and more comfortable with it the more I do.
When did you start doing them?
Well, I started speaking publicly probably more with my science work a number of years ago. So just giving talks at conferences and things. And then
how big were the rooms? How many people?
Really variable. Sometimes 100 and sometimes a couple thousand.
Oh, wow.
So,
that's big.
Yeah. So that's probably where I started practicing public speaking in a more formal context. And then the events I've been doing with the book started right around when the book first came out in March of last year.
Yeah. So having 100 people in a room now is probably nothing for you, right?
Yeah. And I actually find the bigger audiences easier. In some ways, the bigger, the better.
Yeah.
The smaller audiences can be sometimes a bit more awkward, but just depends on the context.
I have several books out, and when my first book came out and I was doing a book tour, I remember I was up at this event in Vancouver at a bookstore. I can't remember the name of the bookstore, but it's one of their big chains. Maybe it was Chapters, and 2 people showed up.
Oh, yeah.
2 people.
That the book outreach and promotion is definitely a project.
I know. I'm actually surprised that they didn't tell me, like, we don't do events here. That's
just not a thing.
Yeah, it wasn't a thing, but they let me book it and whatever. But yeah, what are you going to do?
Yeah,
but, yeah.
It's part of a learning experience.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Well, great. Well, welcome to the Pacific Northwest. Your book that you talked about came out, you said last March?
Yeah, it first came out last March, and the paperback just came out last week.
Oh,
so that's
okay.
Part of the impetus for the travel
Got
now.
it. Fantastic. So it's The Sun as a Compass, a 4,000-mile journey into the Alaskan wilds.
Correct.
So yeah, big adventure. You actually did that in 2012. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And it took you 6 months?
It took 6 months, yeah. Started in middle of March and ended 9th of September.
So middle of March, you probably still some rough weather.
Yeah, it was
there.
a really stormy spring session when we began rowing up the Inside Passage. We left Bellingham. It was on St. Patrick's Day in a hailstorm.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, didn't exactly know what we were doing from the standpoint of rowboats. So we were rowing the whole Inside Passage, and that was not something that either of us had done before. And
this is you and your husband, Pat.
Yeah, my husband Pat and I, not by design exactly, but he ended up building the boats because we couldn't find expedition style rowboats commercially available, and we had decided early on that we wanted to row rather than kayak, in part because we're transitioning to skiing over the coast mountains, and the thought of sitting in a boat with legs atrophying for 6 or 7 weeks and then trying to get up and start skiing and hiking for thousands of miles didn't seem like a great idea. So
that's interesting. So the rowboat gave you just some extra leg workout over a kayak. Is that right?
It's full body because there's a sliding seat insert. So yeah, and it also offered a lot of stability. They're really pretty burly boats for tougher conditions. So.
Yeah. I've had a couple of women on the podcast, ocean rowers and paddlers, and it's not something that I would have given thought to before. So especially for listeners who may not know, at least I'm watching videos and stuff of these women doing these crazy things. So I could kind of understand that a little bit more, but I wouldn't have thought that that was really smart of you, forethought to think, well, we want some leg exercise throughout. So let's take this other kind of row. So an ocean rowing vessel wouldn't have sufficed for you? Would that have been too big?
Well, they're very hard to acquire. You just can't just go out and buy one like you might an expedition style kayak.
It has to be built for you.
It has to be built for you, or you can fabricate one with the shell of a double kayak was one suggestion we had been given. We ended up using plans put together by a couple out of Vancouver Island, Angus rowboats. And then Pat used those to build the boats, and they performed really well. But yeah, they just weren't really available.
And you each had your own boat.
We each had our own boat.
Yeah. Can you describe the expedition kind of big picture so that we can get a better sense of exactly what you did?
Yeah, certainly. So we started, as I mentioned, in March in Bellingham and took rowboats up the Inside Passage to near the community of Haines in southeast Alaska, then transitioned there to skis and pack rafts. And some of your listeners might be familiar with pack rafts, but they're these little inflatable, about 7-pound boats that you can roll up and put in your backpack. And it essentially allows you to be amphibious on the landscape, which is really critical in Alaska and northern Canada, where there really aren't bridges and trails and roads to rely on. So we went up and over the Coast Mountain Range by skis primarily, then got into the headwaters of the Yukon River and paddled a portion of that with a canoe, and then headed north and east over the Tombstone Mountains and up into the Wind River drainage and the Peel River, and eventually the Mackenzie River, which flows north to the Arctic coast. And at this point, we're pack rafting or hiking, and then traveled west along the Arctic coast until we reached the gateway to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. and took a sharp turn south and got into the crest of the Brooks mountain range and then traversed that about 1,000 miles west until we reached the Noatak River and paddled to Kotzebue in a little canoe, which is on the Chukchi Sea. So all human-powered, pretty much all off-road, off-trail, and a variety of modes of transportation, obviously, and lots of really amazing wild country.
Whose crazy idea was it?
Oh, it was a joint one, as most of these things seem to be with my husband and I. But I was just finishing up my PhD in biology at the time and had been studying this cluster of chickadees and other resident Alaskan birds with really severely overgrown beaks, and started off the project very passionate about biology and connections between wildlife health and environmental health. And
you have a PhD in
I have
wildlife
a PhD in
biology.
Yep, exactly, in biology. My focus has been primarily ornithology. And this particular project was fascinating because it was a scientific mystery that no one knew the answer to. And it continues to be fascinating, but it ended up in practice being a really challenging PhD project, in part because we don't know anything about just the basic anatomy of a bird's beak. So I spent most of my 4.5 years, looking at little slices of bird beaks under a microscope and feeling pretty disconnected from the natural world. So that was kind of the professional backdrop of wanting to get out and do a really big expedition.
And you never discovered what the issue was?
We now suspect it's a virus, actually, a novel virus, but still continuing to work on it as kind of a side project. But yeah, that disconnect, I think, for me from the birds and the outdoors and the wildlife that had drawn me to science in the first place really pushed me to want to do something different and have kind of a reckoning with what this career I had might look like. Pat and I had always been really drawn to adventure, and some of our kind of formative experiences together were out doing pretty outrageous trips of one nature or another, but nothing quite on this scale. So when we started dreaming, we pieced together places we'd always wanted to visit with areas that we had some connection to or really loved, and started to draw lines on the map. And then that was what we came up with.
Are you from Alaska?
I'm from Alaska. I grew up there. Yeah.
So you're not somebody who grew up there and then just felt like you had to escape?
No, I think we probably all go through some phase of that, maybe in adolescence, maybe older. I did leave Alaska for college and then for graduate school, but ended up always considering at home.
Where did you grow up?
In Anchorage area, so in South Central Alaska.
Mm-hmm. And do you live in that area now?
I kind of split my time between there and then a small community called Haines, or near Haines. It's off the grid.
Aren't they
remote.
like really well known for the eagles there? Mm-hmm. I don't know why that just like strikes me. I guess I've seen a lot of photos maybe of the bald eagles, and they seem like they're all in Haines.
Yeah, there's the latest salmon run in North America comes up the Chilkat River, and so it's a gathering place for eagles in the fall and late fall. So
do you make sure that you're there every fall to see it, or for you is it not just as special because you kind of grew up with it?
Yeah, I don't necessarily go to the festival or to that area every year. We are different places in different seasons, but yeah, certainly get to see a lot of eagles in the course of being in that region. So
this big adventure, had anybody else done anything like this before? Like it seems very original for one thing, and very well thought out. Were you following in anybody's footsteps, or was this just something that you thought, okay, well, let's see how far we can take this?
We weren't. I mean, there are certainly, people we leaned on for advice about specific regions or aspects of the trip. The Inside Passage has more, description of how people have traveled there previously. So we used that to some degree. But I think part of the beauty for us of adventure and travel is really that element of discovery. And so coming up with a route or a way of seeing places that feels creative and unique is part of the draw. So yeah, I would say a mix that certainly other people have done, equally ambitious and unusual trips, but that particular route wasn't something that we were following. It was something we'd come up with.
Yeah. So. What were the other adventures that you had done?
Well, shortly after we met, we hiked into the headwaters of the Wind River in northern Yukon, so in northern Canada, with just the tools we needed to build a birch bark canoe and what we thought was 60 days worth of food. There was a lot of things that didn't go according to plan. The first being that there were no birch trees at the headwaters of the Wind River. So we ended up building a canoe out of spruce bark, which is a much inferior material, but did in the end work. And also I realized at that time I was 23, Pat was 22, I believe, and that I didn't know how to pack for 60 days of expedition.
Nor should any 23-year-old.
Yeah.
Nor should you know how to build a canoe at 23.
But it was one of those things that was very barely possible. But in the end, we pulled it off. And so I think it really sealed this strong connection for us to sense of adventure.
How long had you been together before you did that?
Oh, not too long. We met in late September of the previous year. So 6-7 months of a distance relationship. So it's a good way to get to know somebody in a hurry.
Gosh,
but,
yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely a formative, both individually, but also together as a couple. So actually on the big trip that we took, it was almost exactly a decade later, we returned to the Wind River. And that was part of our route planning, is that we knew we wanted to come back to this place if we could make it happen. So coming back, a decade later, really different style, was kind of a cool reconnection to place.
So that was your first adventure. Had you done things in between?
Oh, yeah, we had. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of our adventures after that were more climbing, mountaineering, kind of ski, traverse, some pack rafting, kayaking, a little bit of everything. But a lot of the trips we'd done were more technical. And so that was one of the things that we wanted on this trip, was to be able to cover a lot of ground, which meant going lighter and faster and generally not super technical.
Alaska hadn't ever struck me as a place where there are a lot of outdoors people, because I think that your summer is so short. I mean, I know that there's skiing and there's, outdoor activities in the winter, but it hadn't just struck me that there were a lot of people out there, or that are there. I guess that's the question. Mm-hmm. Are there a lot of people who are really kind of active and outdoors people doing the kind of things that you are? I always thought of it as a place where people from the lower 48 went up to spend, time in the summertime doing outdoor activities. But is there a big community for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's probably the one place I've been of anywhere, certainly in North America, besides maybe some parts of Canada, where people are doing some pretty extreme things in very understated fashion. So yeah, it's very much a place that's connected to the outdoors. And, some of it is purely recreational, but a lot of people also have deep connections. And obviously lots of, Native Alaskans who've been there for many thousands of years have been relying on the land and living outdoors. But even, much more recently with non-Native Alaskans, people are very connected to the outdoors and I'd say adventure of all types. But
what do you do with yourself in the wintertime?
I love to ski. It's actually kind of killing me to be down, not so much to be down in the Pacific Northwest, but to be missing winter. March is one of the most lovely times up there when we have snow. And winter, we've had warmer and warmer winters recently, but we finally got good.
You're not down here for too long, though.
No, it's a short trip. Yeah.
So. I know what you mean. It's like, it drives me crazy to be out of Seattle in the summertime, when we have, our short window of really nice weather and I'm off traveling somewhere. And, I'm sure, the place that I go is equally as beautiful, but I'm just like, oh, it's just a short time. I have to be back in Seattle. We've got that short window of really nice weather.
Right.
So I know that.
And snow has this sort of tenuous feature. So when we get it, it's always really nice to be able to enjoy it. But yeah, when we have snow, there's plenty to do in the winter up there.
Yeah. So really big adventure for you. And you said it was kind of a joint decision. Did one or the other of you kind of come up with it? Or was it kind of an expedition that unfolded over time and, we could do this and then it could get bigger and then we could go do this and then we could do that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, that we started, picking out places that we wanted to somehow link in, and it just kept growing. Very iterative process, and partially born of, what's possible, and then beyond that, what might be possible. And
was there ever a time when you just thought you were crazy and you shouldn't do it at all?
Well, certainly when we were leaving in March in the rowboats and had already nasty weather. The boats had only touched water the day before, and we had never been in them. So that's not the ideal way to start an expedition.
Don't try this at home.
Exactly. We did have a lot of ocean experience and worked on the water quite a bit as a field biologist, and we'd spent a fair bit of time. We built a cabin together on the coast of Lynn Canal near Haines, and so spent a fair amount of time on the ocean. So we had a pretty good sense from that, and doing some sailing of tides and currents and basic ocean patterns, which is really important. But the act of rowing was a slow and challenging learning curve initially, just because it was something that was new to us.
Right. But what kind of training did you do to prepare for that?
In general fitness. We're both pretty active people and run and ski and generally stay pretty fit. But
did you find then that once you got in the boat, you were just using completely different muscles, and it took you some time to get used to that?
Yeah, I think that, and just being efficient with the oars. There's these, very long, kind of unwieldy oars. In a rowboat, you're facing backwards, which is a totally different experience, and very specific muscles that probably are only trained if you're rowing rather than anything else. So we did do some time on rowing machines, but it doesn't quite equate. So I think having the length of time, though, we were in the boats for about 7 weeks, certainly long enough to get in shape for rowing over the course of that. So.
Right. And then when did you say that you then transitioned in Haines, was it?
Yeah, it's near Haines. We left the boats at our cabin, which is kind of across the water from Haines, but
that was going to be
place.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. How did you do the transitions between going from boat to land and then also back to water? Is that right? Did I hear that right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we, there's the logistics part of it, which involved figuring out how we were going to get the right gear or equipment in different places. And so the cabin was a logical transition point because we could leave the boats, we could pick up skis and pack rafts and another round of food, mountaineering gear, and head up and over. And then beyond that, for the most part, we relied on the postal service. So we had packages made up beforehand with dates written on them, and you can send things general delivery. And so my folks, primarily my parents, sent the packages on prearranged dates so that they'd be waiting for us in these different post offices.
Mm-hmm. Were they all in the U.S.? There was nothing in Canada?
There was a lot in Canada.
Oh, there was.
You can also
okay.
send general delivery to Canada Post. So that mostly worked fairly well. And then there's, of course, the transition, the physical transition going from one mode of transportation to another, and all the different body parts that have to adjust accordingly. We had some pretty impressive blisters going from being in rubber boots or ski boots, either in the boats or up and over the mountains, and then starting the hiking portion through the Tombstone Mountains. That was a challenging section, which we weren't entirely expecting, but our feet took quite a beating in the process.
Did you take days off completely just to relax?
Occasionally, very few, but once in a while we would take a rest day, or if we were in a community and needed to do some planning or logistics to get us to the next leg, we would. But most of our rest days came about because we were stuck waiting for weather, especially on the Inside Passage. It was really, really stormy, and some days that even the ferries, offshore had been canceled because it was too big of seas. So those were the days where we were kind of stuck on shore, biding our time and trying to make those decisions about what's too risky and how much can you push the boats, how much can you push yourselves.
Did you have a time constraint? Did you have to be back either for work, or was there like kind of a hard stop in terms of the weather? Like, we have to be done by the 23rd of September or a specific date?
Yeah, there was the seasonal component primarily. So things start to freeze up in the Arctic. You can get pretty heavy snow and rivers starting to freeze in September. So we knew that we had to be moving. We figured we had to average about 25 miles a day throughout the whole 6-month period to make it to Kotzebue or to where we wanted to. So that was basically the deadline was set by the conditions and the weather and the seasons.
Were all of those places, I'm putting myself there and just wondering these things, were all of those places brand new for you that you had been to, other than the obvious like Haines? But was it the first time you had set the boat on the Inside Passage and gone up, or had you done any of those segments before, so you at least got a sense of what you were getting into?
We had sailed a portion of the Inside Passage a number of years before, just the southern portion, And we'd paddled a couple of other parts on the Inside Passage before. So we're familiar with some of that, but certainly not, by any means the entirety. And we returned to the Wind River area. So that was, one short section that we had seen before. Most of the rest of it was pretty new to us. We knew the Coast Mountains, but a different portion of the route. We'd been, kind of on the west side over toward Glacier Bay. But pretty much all new things.
Mm-hmm. And biggest surprises along the way? Any big issues that you came across?
We did have issues. For the most part, things went fairly smoothly, but we ran into a lot of challenges with weather and, just extreme conditions. But we had an encounter with a predatory black bear toward the end of the trip that was, we obviously ended up being okay in the end, but it was the first time that I'd ever met a predatory bear. And
so describe that experience.
Yeah. So at this point, we were probably close to 5 months into the trip and had met many dozens of bears up to that point and had some close encounters, but generally bears were behaving as we would have expected. Sometimes we'd come into too close of quarters accidentally and everyone was startled. But in general, we, found that if we were using good bear practices, making noise, announcing our presence, that, we kind of got what we expected. And in this case, we had been in a really thick, brushy section and it was really wet. We'd had about 3 weeks of rain straight and was finally starting to lighten up a little bit. And we're coming out of the bushes and into a more open area. And I heard something rustling behind me and I turned around and there was this big, healthy looking black bear about 10 feet away, just staring at me. And within a matter of seconds, I could tell that its behavior was different than anything I'd ever seen before. And Pat saw what was going on and took a step next to me and just said, "Don't let that bear out of your sight." And sure enough, it circled back around and approached us again and again and again, sometimes to within just a couple of feet.
Were you just standing there or were you actually walking?
We were kind of jockeying with it so that it couldn't get out of our sight because it was clear it had been stalking us up to that point. And it was really interesting from sort of an outside, out of body almost experience to be realizing that in fact, this bear had nothing on its mind except eating us. And so we had to change its mind about who the aggressor was in that situation. And so instead of doing all the things that you would typically do to diffuse a bear encounter,
like getting down on the ground kind of thing?
Never want to get down on the ground unless,
you don't?
Not unless it's really clear that, the bear has attacked because it's feeling defensive or something like that. So the playing dead is for a very specific situation. But in this case, if we had, lay down on the ground, it would have happily come and chomped on us. So being very aggressive.
Well, and thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
That was easy.
Yeah, exactly. So we did carry bear spray with us and we had our trekking poles and there wasn't much in terms of rocks or anything to throw at it. But it turned into about a 30-minute standoff of us fighting back with pretty much everything we had, and we did spray it with the bear spray.
So when you say fighting back with everything you had, what do you mean by that?
Throwing our poles at it, screaming, shouting, trying to look big, be really
like the two of you
physically
together,
aggressive to the bear rather than trying to seem unassuming or non-threatening, which is how you'd want to be in most situations. And the bear spray, it was kind of a strange outcome in that we sprayed, and I absolutely believe in bear spray, but in this case, everything was in such slow motion. The bear's actions were so deliberate and slow that I could actually see the pepper cloud coming and duck its head away from it because it's visible. It's capsicum pepper spray that's sort of reddish in color. And so it ducked its head and it just caught the very edge of the cloud. And so it didn't get that full on, in the eyes and nose, even though it was very, very close to us. So that was a semi-deterrent, but it wasn't the definitive response that we were looking for because sure enough, it came back around. And I think eventually it decided that it wasn't maybe worth the trouble and sauntered off just far enough that we were able to kind of make a break for the nearest river and get on the other side of it. And
did you get your poles back?
We did get our poles back, yeah. And then eventually could get into the river and start paddling and cover some distance and hopefully have it lose our scent. But it really shook our confidence in bear country after having felt pretty comfortable, living and sleeping and doing everything outdoors in thick bear country.
Well, it was probably a good wake-up call, did you change your behavior after that in any way?
I don't think there's anything you could do differently when you have a predatory bear. It's not a matter of, you can make choices when you have an encounter.
Because you're already using probably bear canisters to keep your food in and that kind of thing.
We were not using bear canisters, which isn't really practical if you're going on a long expedition in those kinds of situations, because they're very, very, clunky and cumbersome. But other, bear practices and just making noise, I think, is really critical for when you're traveling through brushy. And awareness is probably, 80% of it is just being aware of your surroundings and thinking about, where do the bears travel? Where are we traveling? How are we likely to have an encounter? So that was certainly one thing that came about as a surprise. Not that we would see bears, but just having an encounter with a predatory bear is a pretty rare situation.
Did it make you want to turn around at all and just stop? Was it that scary?
It certainly was that scary. It wasn't clear how we weren't in a situation where we could just hike to the nearest road and get out of there, even if we chose to. It's a pretty remote part of the Birch Range. But yeah, it did shake our confidence for sure. It took a little while to get our heads back into, okay, that was, a one in a many thousand encounter and really rare for bear behavior. And we just happened to meet a very bad bear. I think where we were feeling our energy was probably the lowest, and the prospects of quitting were the highest was not when it was physically the most challenging or when we were most scared, but on the Mackenzie Delta, which is the Mackenzie River is what we took north to the Arctic coast. It was just the most downright miserable experience I probably had, both the bugs and the mud. There's this incredible phenomenon that happens up on the Arctic coast, and with the tides are pretty minimal, like less than half a foot. So it's a totally different ocean than what we're used to on the Pacific coast or, many of the other oceans around the world. But the onshore winds can really drive the tides quite dramatically and cause the river levels to rise or fall by something like several feet, in a fairly short period of time. But the net effect of that is it can force certain river channels or sloughs to be running the opposite direction. So we were paddling downriver and functionally upriver. And so, just trying to put our heads down and make it through this 10 or 12 day section of the most intense mosquitoes I'd ever seen, even though I'd worked outside in Alaska for most of my life. And
what time of year was this at that point?
It was early July, end of June, early July. So really, the caribou are nowhere to be found in that part of the Delta that time of year, because the thought of being exsanguinated, which is essentially like losing all of your blood by blood-sucking insects, is a very real possibility for caribou calves, that mosquitoes are that bad. So that, I think, was the most challenging part of the trip in terms of keeping up the resolve. And, once you start to question the absurdity of what's by nature an absurd trip, it all slowly falls apart.
Were you covered in bites?
Oh yeah, totally covered in bites. And they would find their way, up
through all your
every
clothes,
bit of clothing, through clothing.
Are you prone to being bitten in the first place?
Not particularly. I think I'm average, but there was no avoiding being just pockmarked with mosquito bites. The cloud of buzzing insects
and then it probably
around our bodies
took another few weeks for that to subside, right? The actual bites.
No, that's not so bad. It was a few days.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah, but the period of actually being in the thick of it was close, 12 days or something.
Ooh,
so
that's a long
time. It's a lot
time.
of days of
I tracked mosquitoes. So next time, just bring me along, and they'll all be on me.
Nice.
But they tend to find me when they're not on anybody else. And I've been in places, notably Papua New Guinea, like in the tropics. And I took a shower one time, and just in the time of, it was an outdoor shower in this very remote village. And just in the time of like getting undressed, taking a quick shower, and then turning the shower off, I probably had at least 100 bites on my calves, and it was just a really short amount of time. It was terrible.
Ugh, yeah.
What are you going to do?
Don't go to the Mackenzie Delta.
No, I don't think that's for me at all.
Summer,
No, not at that time of year. Note to self, for sure. What was the reason for the adventure? Like what made you decide? You'd done some other smaller adventures in the past. Why did you want to take on something that was so big?
Well, I think there were a number of reasons. I'd sort of mentioned before where I was in terms of my connection to science and really feeling like I needed to find a way back in.
Well, there's a lot of ways to do it.
Certainly, yeah. Yep. That was a
6-month trip up the Inside Passage, to the Arctic Circle. May not be one of them.
Yeah, crash course
for most people. Yeah,
right. But we were also at a kind of transition point personally as well. It wasn't too long before that. My dad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and he is someone I always looked to as kind of a physical model of strength, but also someone who could do whatever he set his mind to. And, watching him face, and all of us face, kind of a different reality, I think was very eye-opening in terms of the urgency in doing what it is that drives you, makes you excited and passionate to do it when you have the chance. And we'd also been dreaming about something like this for a very long time. And so it was the right moment for us to take this on. We were in our early 30s, and the thought of having a family and possibly settling down, although I don't think that's ever going to be fully in the cards for us. But yeah, all of those things were on our minds, that we knew that time was somewhat fleeting. And so if we were going to take something on this scale, we needed to go.
Were you working a full-time job at that point?
Well, I was finishing my PhD, so I was a full-time student. I was writing my dissertation.
So it wasn't like you had to explain to colleagues what you were doing?
Well, I mean, I did, in the sense that that's not a conventional thing to do as soon as you finish your PhD. You don't take off for the better part of a year. So there's some of that. And I did have a job that came up that I committed to partway through the trip, and knew that I was returning to that. But I did say no to a couple of other opportunities, including a NSF fellowship through Princeton. There's certain things that I think when we talk about big adventures or big challenges, it doesn't matter if they're outdoors or something else, that one of the things that makes them possible is that there's a lot of other opportunities you have to say no to, and figuring out, which of those things you're okay passing up kind of at the expense of doing something that requires all of your time and attention and energy and passion. So
how do you make that decision?
I guess it's very case by case. I'm starting to learn that I never regret going, but I do regret when I don't go. And so I have been trying to figure out how to say yes to those big things that are opportunities that you don't necessarily get again and again. So we have two young children now. They're 3 and 5. And so we've had to make some of those choices as a family too. What is it that we want to do, because work is always calling. I still work as a professional research biologist. And
do you have a 9-to-5 job?
I do. I've tried to scale back to part-time so that I can write as well, which is also could be easily a full-time job. But yeah, there's lots of work demands all the time, of course, as we all know. And same thing for my husband. He has a design and build company and plenty of work to keep him busy. But we've also chosen to try to find periods of time where we can go out as a family and be outdoors and be doing the things that we love. And that requires sometimes making, explanations to people that don't always make sense. And I'm sure you can relate to that, with travel. And
how do you end up scheduling those kinds of things? And are they weekend events, or like weekend things that you do, activities? Or are you talking about, we're going to take off a week and we're going to go do this thing?
Yeah, or I'm talking about months in some cases. So
can you give examples of what you've done or what you're planning to do?
Yeah, we did. So it was not this last summer, the summer before, we took off with our 2 boys who were 20 months and 4 at the time, almost 4, and sailed up the Inside Passage on a little 32-foot sailboat.
And some people would say that's crazy right there.
It's crazy, or they don't agree with that choice, or why aren't you working? And
did you literally get that kind of feedback from people?
Yeah, I actually had a piece published in the New York Times last May, And I would say, for the most part, people were excited and interested and supportive. But there's certainly plenty of people who feel like, that, well, for one, that travel is always extravagant no matter how you do it. This wasn't a particularly extravagant trip. If anyone climbed on our boat, they would know it's not not exactly the ship of a queen or anything. But you do have to say no to certain things and be okay with following a little bit of an unconventional path. And that's not always easy. It's much easier to do what's expected of us, I think. So there's that pushback. And, with kids, there's the element, of course, of risk and safety. And how do you keep everyone as healthy and as safe as you can while still making a lifestyle that works for everyone? So I think there's that.
Do you think that travel is extravagant?
Not necessarily. I think we build it up in our minds. And I often hear questions about how could you fund a trip like this? And in reality, that 6 months that we spent traveling was actually far cheaper than it would be to live in a conventional house with a conventional mortgage and even not a nice car, just a regular car, and all of those things that I think we take for granted. And it's not to say that those are not good choices or that, something else is a better choice. It's just that there's different ways of doing it. And we tend not to live really extravagantly in whatever context it is. But I think that travel, really the biggest sacrifice you have to make is saying no to other things. And that can be hard because we all want to say yes all the time, and it can't all be done. But to throw time and energy and whatever finances you have at travel, requires certain compromises and sacrifices. But in my mind, it's totally worth it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do agree. I haven't heard, or I haven't ever been accused of, no one's ever said to me that travel is extravagant. I don't think I've heard that term before, kind of aimed at me. I do realize that I live a very privileged life because I am traveling so much, but it's my business too. I've created a business around this. So it's not like I'm just off on pleasure trips all the time. But I also think, like you said, there are things that you just have to say no to, and you have to have the confidence to live an unconventional life. And that could mean taking all 2 weeks of your vacation.
Right. Yeah. There's
from your job.
So many different scales.
Yeah. Because a lot of people don't even do that.
Mm-hmm. And there's always pressure to, work more and work harder and put in more hours and to...
Especially in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Not necessarily across the world. And I guess I feel that same sense of work ethic. I do work hard on the things that I throw myself at, and taking on a book project and becoming a writer a bit later in my life and career has been a big challenge. So it's not that there's this inherent lack of work ethic because you want to do things unconventionally, right. But I think sometimes that's the perception that's easy to feel from other people, that it's not their model, which is totally fine, but it's okay to have different people find different ways of kind of achieving their balance or their happiness. So.
Yeah. And I also think too that people are making choices every single day that are putting them deeper in the hole or further away from travel. And that's and there's no, there's no judgment here, because I realize we all need our vices and we all need our things. But I just think about the $100 cable bill that people are paying just because a month, that they feel like they have to pay, they have to have that cable bill every month. And we just don't. And I just think, can you imagine if you just put that money away? That's a lot of money in a year's time. And all the meals that we eat out, that's a lot of money that adds up in a year's time that could be used for travel.
Yeah, certainly. And not being afraid to dream, I guess, is part of it. That we get kind of boxed into thinking that there's a certain way to do things, and just having that freedom to think big and to dream big and see where it takes you. But I mean, all that said, I agree. I certainly acknowledge there's a lot of privilege inherent to having, the resources to even be thinking about doing things out of kind of the standard in terms of working and things. But
well, how did you learn that? You had mentioned that your dad is he still alive?
He's still alive.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you'd mentioned that he's always been very physically active. And I'm imagining with that kind of a can-do attitude. Did you pick that up directly from him, from your parents, from your family? Or where did you learn that you could just get out and make up your own activities and adventures?
Yeah, both my parents are pretty adventurous in their own right. My mom she would be skiing a 50-kilometer ski race. She just turned 70 last year. If she wasn't down with her grandbaby this week. So yeah, both of them have always been quite adventurous. They both immigrated as children. My mom from Germany, my dad from the Netherlands, and then met in Michigan where they grew up and traveled to Alaska thinking they were just going for a visit in the early 70s and then never left. And my dad started a civil engineering company. My mom was a special ed teacher. And yeah, they, I guess, just kind of helped me see that there's lots of different ways to make your way in the world. And
do you think that comes from their European background?
Perhaps somewhat, I think, yeah. And, coming to a new situation and being open to it. Both of my parents really embraced that. You can set them down just about anywhere in the world and they'll be glad to meet new people and experience new things. So I definitely feel like I learned from that. They were also very active with us growing up. I was not always a very cooperative adventurer. I was pretty reluctant for a lot of years.
No
I was
kidding.
A total bookworm and just wanted to sit on the couch and read my books and have adventures vicariously. But I would say when I was in college, it started to come back around and realize that, actually, I do like to move my body. So
where'd you go to college?
I was at University of Arizona in Tucson for most of it and did a year in Eugene, Oregon, and then I did a master's program at Western Washington University, just north of here in Bellingham, and did my PhD in Fairbanks, University of Alaska.
Yeah. So when you were in Arizona and Eugene, did having exposure to those areas make you want to get out more and just be out in nature?
Oh, you mean versus being in Alaska or?
Well, you said that you weren't necessarily an adventurer when you were younger. So being in these other environments, was there something that happened there where you're like, oh yeah, I want to go hike in this canyon, or I want to go to the mountains outside of Eugene and go skiing, or just do something different that you hadn't done in Alaska?
I think it was a combination of, I'm pretty hard-headed. And so as a kid, it wasn't my idea to go outside and suffer.
Good admission. Okay.
When it became my idea, it was a lot more appealing. And also it was for me, the science component in biology, I really fell in love with it through a field course in conservation biology. And it was an older professor who was passionate about birds and about hummingbirds in particular. And he would take us to all these wild places and look for birds and do, these sort of
This is in Arizona?
Yeah, in Arizona, yeah. Mm-hmm. Strange field trips. And so that got me interested. And then I think connecting with friends, I found that was where I made my closest friendships was through being outside and doing things, whether it was running or hiking or playing Frisbee or, something that was, just allowed me to meet new people. So that was part of it too.
You have a background also in travel. Like you have traveled beyond the U.S. and Canada. Where else have you been?
Yeah, not as much recently. I did spend some time in Botswana. A friend was running a wild dog project in the Okavango Delta, and so I spent some time there.
What's a wild dog project?
Wild dog it's a species of canid. Wild dogs, they're also called painted wolves, these really remarkable animals that live in southern Africa and travel in packs. There's some elements that are pretty similar to wolves, pretty endangered as well. They face a lot of different threats. And so it was a field biology job. And I was just down there kind of volunteering and learning about the
For how
ecology
long?
in that area. A couple of months. And that was quite a long time ago. I traveled to more recently when my older son was about 18 months. We were down in Chile and Patagonia region and did some trekking down there and got to visit an old friend. And but a lot of our travel has been more centered around Alaska and the North and the Arctic. It's a place that we're pretty drawn to. And so I think a lot of the sort of new environments or travel experiences for us tend to be in the mountains, on glaciers, or, dealing with the ocean or different kinds of travel experiences, I guess.
And are you doing those kinds of experiences mainly in the summertime, or are you doing them in the winter?
Both. Probably our next trip will be next month, ski some kind of ski traverse up in Alaska. And obviously, since having children, the scale of the trips has changed so that we're either going for shorter periods of time. So we're not away from the kids for weeks and weeks or months and months, but they're old enough now that we can actually get out together as a couple and continue to do some of the adventures we love. But more than anything, we've adopted our own sort of travel to fit kids into the mix. And last winter, we also had the chance, we took a sort of a sabbatical last year, and we're either at a remote cabin or on the sailboat, or we spent a couple of months in New Zealand traveling with a little camper van.
This is with the
family.
kids.
Mm-hmm. This is with the kids. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, we were the camper van. It's a loose term because it was basically a passenger van that had a chemical toilet that the people we bought the van from said, "Oh, you don't really use this. It's just, so you can sort of check off your box." And yeah, a 5-gallon bucket with the hand pumps. And we were all sleeping on one queen size mattress that we had to fold down the seat to do. So it was nothing like an RV. It was a very, very basic van. But yeah, we were essentially living outside for a couple of months, and then between that and the sailboat and then being this remote place, we had more or less a year outside, living in very tiny spaces or just outdoors.
Is it daunting to you to embark on a trip like that, like to New Zealand? Or is it, do you just think like, oh, this sounds like fun. Let's plan for this? Because I think for the average American, I would say, because I don't have kids myself, but I'll talk to people with kids, with young kids, and they just think, I'm not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere with our kids until they are, actually the excuse is until they're old enough to remember the trip.
I got that a lot in the article, and I found it really fascinating because the first, what do they say, the first, 18 months of life, most of the critical development period.
Yeah, it's like the most formative, right?
Doesn't really matter if they remember. No. I guess that in my mind, that's not the point. I mean, I understand what people are saying, but it's absolutely intimidating and overwhelming and can be a logistical nightmare to travel with kids. There's no doubt about that. And I guess that's part of when I was talking before about not only saying no to things, but being willing to accept the hard stuff and the parts that aren't so pretty about, traveling with a kid in diapers on a sailboat. It's, it's a pain. No doubt about it.
And you must just be focused on the good outcome of it, like the benefits of it far outweigh the negative or the hassle factor of it.
Yeah. And I just think there are experiences that you don't know how rich something might be until you give it a try. And I guess it comes back to that whole idea of never regretted going, even though at times you think, you're in the midst of diapers and, vomit and whatever else, and just thinking like, why didn't I just stay home? That would have been an awful, a whole lot easier. And it would have been, but then, maybe in the midst of that, a whale surfaces 10 feet from the boat and you think, well, this is why I'm here. This isn't an experience I would have otherwise. So yeah, I think it's not to say that that's for everyone or that it's easy, but to us, it's been something that's really important to kind of embody as part of our lifestyle. And because we do have children now, it means that our family is trying to figure out creative ways and constantly adjusting depending on where everyone is in terms of their stages and development and interests and abilities. So
the article that you wrote, you said for the New York Times, was that before your trip?
Nope, it was after we had sailed. We did another sailing trip last summer, and we'll probably head out on the sailboat again in a couple of months. But that was after the big trip we had taken. This was in just last May, so May of 2019,
right.
The article came out.
Right, but you wrote about a trip that you had taken with your kids.
The Inside Passage, yeah.
Okay, and that's what you got flack about? You had some people giving you flack?
Yeah, and I think that I think writing about children in general or writing about parenting in general.
You have a big target on your
I remember thinking that as soon as I was visibly pregnant, that people love to give advice and tell you how it is that you should be as a parent before you even become a parent. And I think that carries through. People have very strong opinions about it. And in general, in our culture, we have very sort of low risk tolerance. Like there's a strong sense of risk aversion, which I understand. And I feel that way as a parent too. Of course, I want my children to be safe and happy and healthy. But we don't often recognize risks for what they are. I think something that's unfamiliar is seen inherently as a risk when in fact what we were doing, I felt like we were doing very safely, and I would feel much more comfortable doing that than, zooming down I-5 in a car with my kid in the car seat and hoping for the best. So
I think a lot of times what happens, whether it's something that you're embarking on with kids or just an adventure that you're doing on your own, like the adventure that you and Pat did, it seems like people don't see everything that goes into the preparation of it. So they immediately think that it's dangerous because they don't know.
Sure.
But when you've done all the preparation and you've done all the research and you have the experience and you have all the right gear, it's completely different for you because you're going into it just with a completely different attitude and a knowledge base.
And it's very calculated risk, right? Like we're not just, and arguably some of the previous trips we'd done were much riskier because we were dealing with conditions that have a lot of objective hazard, and there's no getting around that. There's a lot of things in the mountains that there's just inherent risk you cannot get out of. You can be as skilled and as prepared as you want, but that the bigger trip that Pat and I did before kids, there was the risk of exposure because it was so long and we were out for so long, but the actual day-to-day sort of acute exposure or acute risk was actually quite a bit lower than what we were accustomed to. And I think, with the sailing, for us, that felt like a pretty controlled environment. Not to say that things can't go wrong, and sometimes they do.
But they go wrong everywhere, like you said,
life
on
is risky.
I-5.
Yeah. So I think trying to figure out, where that comfort zone is for different people is really important, but not being afraid of something just because it's unfamiliar, assuming that because you don't know how to do it or you're not comfortable with it, that it's unsafe for someone else too, isn't always very accurate.
So the 4,000-mile journey that you took, it was not only just kind of a big adventure, but it took you 6 months. I mean, that's a lot of endurance to put yourself through, like the day after day. I think the closest that I could come to kind of relating to that was I did I've actually done it twice. It's a 25-day trek through Bhutan in the Himalayas, and it's up to 18,000 feet or so. And so you're going over maybe 10 or 11 passes that are over 16,000 feet. It's a slow slog, it's because it's day after day of getting up and doing the same thing. You wake up in the morning, you have your bed tea brought to you, you have your hot tea, you pack up your things, you go to breakfast, and then you set out, and you will be going for, it's about 8 to 13 miles. So it's going to take you 6 to 8, sometimes 12 hours, depending on the terrain. And you get to camp, you have dinner, and then you sleep, and then you do the whole thing over day after day for 25 days. So 24 nights in a tent, basically. So not comfortable, beautiful, but not comfortable. But you did that for 6 months. It changed. Your mode of transportation changed, and the environment changed, and the landscape changed. But there's a lot of endurance, like mental endurance, that you have to go through to do something like that. How do you prepare yourself? Like, did you think of it in those terms? That it was really kind of an endurance, a mental endurance event as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think endurance probably sums it up the best. And I'm an endurance athlete in general. I mean, I didn't start off that way as a kid as much as I could avoid it, but I really like long distance running and skiing and different things. So I think we both went into it with that endurance attitude. But that said, it takes a while to really hone, your ability to accept the fact that it's hard and it's going to be hard, and probably tomorrow will be hard too. And our feet were wet every single day of those 6 months. So trying to just get used to a certain level of discomfort. And something was always hurting. There's always a achy body part or a sore toe or I don't know what, something. So yeah, I think endurance kind of became this state of mind where we had to embrace the idea that, things will at some point change. And so I think I trained my mind to take the long view on things. And it also forces a really strong sense of presence and just being grateful for, okay, it's been a couple of hours, now it's time for a snack break. And, granola bar we vacuum sealed a lot of peanut butter. So that was one of our staples.
How do you vacuum seal peanut butter?
You can mix up a thing of raw peanut butter and try to avoid getting too much of the oil in because that'll suck out the vacuum, and then vacuum seal it. It works great, and it keeps for a really long time. We would ship it to ourselves because we couldn't get cheese and dairy and a lot of the higher fat foods in a lot of these more remote communities, and so it was a staple, and it tastes good on everything.
Yeah. So I ask because I'm doing these runs. I think I mentioned I'm doing these runs this year, and I have to carry all of my own food. That container right there is it's like what needs to go into my backpack.
Yeah.
Like my backpack, quote unquote. It'll be somewhere between probably 17 and 20 or like low 20s pack, like that pound.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Yeah. So one of the things I have to do is bring all my food, and I just bought a vacuum sealer for it and a dehydrator. I don't know how much I'm going to actually bring my own dehydrated food, but this peanut butter thing is great because I bring peanut butter every time I travel because I'm vegetarian.
Oh, yeah.
I bring peanut butter every time I travel. But if I could have it
any
vacuum
nut butters. And it's nice because you can just cut the corner off and then it squeezes like a tube, and it's really easy to roll back up again and put a rubber band around or a little paper clip or something. But yeah, so that, I guess that
I'm going to practice on that.
Enjoying those small luxuries so much, or having a dry pair of socks in the backpack to put on at night. Like I looked forward to those things so much. But we had this really strong shared sense of purpose every day that does give this.
Was the purpose to finish?
And not even so much about finishing. I mean, I think it was a giant goal. And of course, we set off with the hope that we might be able to pull it off. But after a little while, it wasn't about the finish so much as it was just the experience. And like you said, it was long enough that it started to feel like a lifestyle. We were outside every single day and really had our fingers on the pulse of, what the winds were doing and the sky and the animals, and being kind of part of this larger sense of movement and migration was a really powerful experience. We came to rely really heavily on caribou in the Birch Range in the northern part of the trip up in the Arctic. And they've pounded these trails out for many thousands of years, on their migrations. And so to be able to use their wisdom and their guidance definitely added to that sense of purpose, and that, of course, we weren't migrating like they were because we had the physical needs to go to our wintering grounds, but it was much more easy to feel connected to the landscape and to the wildlife. And
literally following in their footsteps.
Yeah, we were following their trails, and sometimes they were really obvious from a visual standpoint, and other times we could just feel them underfoot because you could tell when you stepped off of them. And there were plenty of times we thought maybe we were smarter than the caribou and tried to forge our own route when we didn't like where they were headed, like across a river or something, and every time found that in fact they were right and they did know better. And toward the end of the trip, we had a really powerful experience. So I didn't mention this before, but besides the predatory bear, we had kind of a string of challenges. It had started to rain, and it rained day after day, and that part of the world is technically considered a polar desert because it gets so little precipitation, but we were in this stretch of pretty intense flooding, and so the whole landscape was just overwhelmed by water, made river crossings really difficult, and we were cooking with open fire, so it was really difficult to get a hot meal prepared. Just the basic kind of day-to-day existence was much more challenging and kind of miserable. And then we had the problem with the predatory bear, and then we ran into a lot of snow up high trying to get up and over the passes. You'd asked earlier about what was, setting the deadline for a trip, and that was part of it. It was late August, but it was already really snowy, and we couldn't get over this pass that we had intended to and tried several times, and then finally had to take a much longer unknown route that had us walking literally off the maps that we carried with us to try to find an alternative. And we eventually did, but it meant cutting our food rations in half for that period. And
how many days off the path did you go? Off the route?
I guess when we realized that we couldn't get over this pass without pretty serious avalanche hazards, probably was another 4, 5, 6 days, something like that. So, added, and when we were going 10 days to 2 weeks between resupplies for the most part. So that added a lot of time and distance. And at that point we had to really cut back on our food. So when we got to the Noatak Valley, which was going to be our final resupply point, and we're ready to paddle down the river, This was a one place on the whole trip we had air support. And so we were expecting a plane to come and deliver our final resupply. And the plane couldn't get to us. So we sat there with just a couple of granola bars, a few tablespoons of olive oil, and one package of instant ramen for almost 5 days.
No kidding.
Yeah, very, very humbling experience.
Oh my gosh. So did you eat it and then not have anything for days, or did you try to stretch it out?
We stretched it out.
That had to be
It was pretty
miserable.
excruciating. And we were already stretched pretty thin in terms of our reserves. We'd been going hard and didn't have a lot to eat leading up to it. And that was the first time that we were dependent on somebody else for getting a resupply. We'd always been able to just get to where we needed to go, but there was no way we could do that at that point. And so anyway, that was a really humbling experience. Also quite late in the trip, when we finally did get the resupply, obviously we survived. I'm here, but when we finally got the resupply and started paddling down the river, feeling pretty ready to make it to the Chukchi Sea into Kotzebue, and it had started raining again. It wasn't a whole lot to see as we're paddling downriver. And then noticed what looked like a couple of branches floating across the river, and then some more. And it turned out it was the Western Arctic caribou herd on their fall migration. And so we pulled to the side of the river and sat to watch them. And as we were there, kind of heard this loud sound behind us and ducked down. And within just a matter of seconds, we were totally surrounded by caribou. And so thousands and thousands of caribou crossed right in front of us, inches away from us at times. And
were you at risk of being trampled?
No, they're pretty careful. But it was incredibly powerful.
Did you get a lot
experience.
of pictures?
We got a lot of pictures, and just to be kind of present with them as they were going on this migration that we'd been, feeling and sort of present for, but not actually seen hundreds of thousands of animals move, in a single herd at times. And to have crossed paths with them at that particular moment, by the morning, they were totally gone, and they crossed most of the night. You could hear them in the dark as they were swimming across. We camped right there. Yeah, I'm not sure how I got on that topic exactly, except to say that was part of that sort of endurance state of mind, to be feeling like we were moving across that landscape, sort of like animals.
I've got lots of questions, but I do want to bring it back to that kind of endurance thing. Is that something that you personally prepare for well in advance? Or is it just something that you take on day by day? Like, okay, this is what I have to do today to get through, through another day of this. Or do you really do kind of a preparation ahead of time to say, we're going to be out there for 6 months and I need to get used to either being uncomfortable or doing the same thing day after day, or eating foods that I'm not going to be able to, just cook my regular chicken tonight, or have my chicken pad thai as usual. It's gonna be completely different. So is it in advance that you prepare for that, or is it on a daily basis?
I think both. And now I do feel like I have some endurance reserves I can pull on that it's almost like a turning of a switch, having had that experience and other experiences where it is just a matter of every day getting up and knowing that it's going to be challenging and there'll be some kind of unexpected rewards along the way.
Well, I think part of it too is knowing that it'll be over.
Exactly. And you start to trust that.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. I had a woman actually on the snowman trek that I was describing before. And she's like she's not a nurse, but she's a lab tech, and she travels around the country doing different, working at different labs. And she had said, sometimes it's just not the ideal environment, and there's politics and, personality, problems within the work. But she said, I just know that it will be over, that it's temporary, and that it'll be over. And that's how she approached the snowman trek too. And that's how I approach things too. Anything that's difficult, I just think this isn't going to last forever. Yeah, right. And you know that eventually it'll be over, and that it'll be whatever the type B fund, or whatever they call it, where it's not fun when you're doing it, but when you look back, you've grown from it and it was a good experience, and you're bringing lots of great things out of it. Taking a lot of great things out of it. But just looking at it as if you can remind yourself that these things are temporary, then it takes a lot of pressure off. For sure. Yeah. When you speak at events, because you've got a lot of great stories, like really fascinating stories, which I know are in the book. What do you speak about when you go into like an REI and give a presentation?
I mean, some of the things we talked about today, but I also have a lot of photographs and video to share, so I can do a combination of readings that complement some of the images. And everyone's a little bit different. I sometimes talk about the writing process a bit because that in itself is quite a journey.
Well, I imagine it going to an event or speaking at an event like REI, you know that the crowd is going to have some kind of an adventure streak in them, and you want to talk about the bear, the predatory bear, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, some of that. I talk about birds because they're really important characters in the book. Yeah, I guess different elements of it. People are curious about endurance, about the logistics. I tend to talk less about that and answer more questions about it because then I can speak specifically to people's interests, whereas I'm not a super techie kind of gear oriented person. I do that stuff because it's necessary to having, the kinds of experiences that I enjoy having, but I'm not the kind of person who's going to geek out on whatever latest, greatest piece of equipment or technology. So that's not what I naturally am inspired to talk about, but I tend to answer a lot of questions in that vein. I tend to answer questions a lot about, writing and how a book comes into the world and that process too. So yeah, kind of different things. I've spoken to scientific audiences. So then I tend to focus a bit more on, the research elements, not the straight up research, but my experience with it and how I got interested in birds in the first place and how I sort of fell out of love with science and then later fell back in love with it and some of those things.
So how does a book come into the world?
Oh, so many different ways. I mean, I can just speak to my experience, but yeah, I started writing on the trip itself. I was journaling, but it tended to be more of like a naturalist log as opposed to, anything that would ever go into a book besides as a record keeping. But I did that pretty religiously, like almost every day I wrote about the experiences. And so when I started, I knew that I wanted to work on some kind of writing project, but I didn't know what shape it would take. And I certainly had no idea how to put a book together. And so I started writing after we finished the trip, writing down observations and scenes. And I probably tended a little bit too much toward the sort of scientific, in part because I had just finished almost 5 years of doing PhD work in science. And so that's what I had been recently trained to do.
Were you literally writing in a journal, or were you tapping it out on a phone or a tablet?
I had a little roll-up keyboard that weighed a couple of ounces, and that paired with a phone. I did also use a Write in the Rain, but I'm a really slow hand writer. So it was nice to have some of those records already electronic, because then when I started, even though it really was like starting from scratch, it didn't feel that way because there's words on the page. And yeah, so I started writing down scenes and observations, and then little by little figured out what some of the personal threads were that were important to the story. And then at some point the birds entered in, and that is where I really found my natural voice, I think, and pretty important element of the story. But I didn't go into it knowing that it was also a book about birds. So yeah, so it was a interesting process for sure. I learned a ton and plenty of challenges in writing.
It's carving out the time for it quite often is just, there's so many more quote unquote important things to do.
Yeah, I think carving out time and just figuring out, like what is the story that you're trying to tell and why does it matter and where are the universals? Because the universal is not that everyone necessarily wants to go on a 6-month trek, but there are a lot of universals in our experiences that translate no matter what your interests and passions are. So yeah, figuring that out and, and just the craft of writing. I certainly have a background. I have a master's in creative writing, but it wasn't something I'd put a lot of time and energy into doing as a professional until later. So yeah, sort of figuring some of that out and trying. Publishing world's challenging. And
especially today, right?
There's a lot to be figured out in all of that. And
I mean, it's certainly if you want to make a living or if you want to make any money at all, it's super challenging. Because everybody's writing and everybody's taking photos. So there's no money, not a lot of money. To be made.
Definitely challenging industry.
So you mentioned you had a roll-up keyboard and your phone. Did you have other technology that you were using?
We had a handheld GPS. So at the time, I think the technology was available, but I wouldn't say we're total Luddites, but we weren't certainly on the cutting edge of all the available resources. But we didn't use like Topo or Gaia or any of the apps that I certainly use now. But at the time, we didn't. So we had paper maps. We had some photographs of satellite imagery, which generally is really poor up in the Arctic anyway. And we had a handheld GPS, and then we took a satellite phone with us.
For emergencies, yeah.
Emergencies, communicating with family, and just logistical coordination. So many communities, in many of these rural and remote locations, it's not just a matter of shooting a text to somebody. Not that we had texting capability anyway, but the phone can be nice to actually hear somebody's voice and have them hear you. And sometimes the really sophisticated technology like we use now, a little spot or in-reach device that you can text from. And that's great. But I think the phone added an element that just the texting didn't have. So that was kind of nice at times. But
did you miss not being connected? Or is it like when you got back to civilization, quote unquote, were you just repelled by it? Oh,
I mean, somewhere in between. I would say I was overwhelmed, and I continue to be overwhelmed by just the constant input. It's hard to, you could spend your entire day on your phone or whatever.
Email
on
engineer.
The computer. Yeah, it's a lot to keep that all going. But, in a strange way, I felt even more connected when I was out because I had that sort of freedom of thought and the luxury of time to be thinking about people and relationships that I think, some of those most important relationships we don't always give the time and attention to because we simply don't have it. And being free of all the other input did allow me to have that focus. And so I felt closer to some of the people in my life who I hadn't seen, obviously, in months.
Interesting.
Than I probably ever have beyond that. So that was kind of an surprising experience, is that feeling that connection even from a distance.
Yeah, that's interesting how that happens because everything is stripped away.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, you don't have those inputs, so it just gives you that time to kind of meditate on it and think about it.
Yeah, what's important and why do you love people? And I don't know, simple things, but we just don't always have that space in our minds to stop and reflect. And
did the opposite happen? Did you think, I can't believe I didn't get a refund for that thing? Did you have those?
No, I think those extraneous thoughts very quickly get put in their place when you're out and you realize like, okay, it's me.
Because it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's me. It's the elements. Like whether I, saved $30 or didn't, it really isn't going to affect my life that much.
Right. Yeah.
But I can spend a lot of mental energy being upset about it. So.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to still chat about? I know we've kind of gone round about a bunch of different things, which I think is just super fascinating, from some of the details to kind of the bigger picture of the journey. But is there something kind of specific or any kind of message or takeaway that you would want to leave people with?
Yeah, I don't think I have any real message. I would say that from my own experience, that when I have the opportunity to go and to do something different that challenges me, I'm always really grateful that I did. So go if you can, whatever that looks like in your own life. And I try to take that advice to heart myself too.
Yep, I agree with you. I think that's a really great thing to live by. Sometimes I try to put myself in a place 5 months in advance of when something might end and think, or even a month, like, would I regret not having done that thing last month? And if the answer is yes, then you just know to do it. And then you just figure out how you're going to do it.
Yeah.
Whether it puts you into debt temporarily or whatever it is, just do it. Because I think you've got to feed your soul. I think that's a big part of it, is you just got to follow things and feed your soul to make it happen. Okay, so a couple things as we just wrap up here. I like to ask guests, what does it mean to you to be bold?
I think it's to embrace new experiences or experiences they present themselves as much as possible by tempering fear. I mean, I, of course, am as fearful as anyone else, and sometimes I let that speak, but I try to make a conscious effort that when I have a really strong negative reaction to something, that because it's new or it's intimidating or it puts me out of my comfort zone, that it's okay to be fearful for a minute, but that isn't ultimately what should make that decision. So maybe being bold is a bit of tempering what can be the opposite of bold, which is to be afraid and to be, hesitant to try something new. And as much as anybody, I cringe a little bit when I get out of my comfort zone, but it's really where we all grow the most.
Right. So you recognize it, but then push through.
Yeah, it's okay to be afraid, and then think about what else you might feel beyond fear. By pushing limits.
Where can people find you? What's the best place to find you? Are you on social media, or is it through your website?
Yeah, both. My website is easy. It's www.carolinevanhemert.com. You can find information about the book, and I keep a blog about current adventures and events and different things. And I'm also on social media. Instagram is at Sun is a Compass. So that's
The Sun is a Compass?
At Sun is a Compass.
Sun is a Compass.
Yeah,
at Sun is a Compass.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I try to post fun photos of Alaska and the outdoors and different adventures and experiences we have the chance to enjoy. So
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to see you there.
Yeah, great. And I'll link to all of that in the show notes. So thanks so much. I'm so glad. I know you've got your between speaking gigs. So thanks so much for stopping in and having a chat.
You.
Yeah.
It's great to talk.
Talk about social distancing, right? Well, I know it's totally impractical to even think about organizing such a trip at this time, but I have to tell you, it certainly sounds really appealing to me. If you enjoyed today's conversation, there are some other episodes with adventurous women that I think you'd really enjoy listening to if you haven't already. I'd suggest checking out Leah Ditton on episodes number 116 and also number 80. And it's worth mentioning that Leah is currently rowing solo from San Francisco to Hawaii, attempting to break the record for number of days on that crossing. I'd also suggest checking out my conversation with Susan Conrad on episode number 114. Susan rowed 1,200 miles of the Inside Passage, and she did that solo in an 18-foot kayak. She was scheduled for another row this summer, but she decided against it when the pandemic hit. You can find those and all of my other episodes, as well as links to all the things we chat about at shesboldpodcast.com/episodes or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. In the next episode of the She's Bold podcast, Chris Fagan and I sit down over Zoom and talk about how we're getting through the pandemic and how we've drawn from our endurance sporting activities to endure this current challenge. If you'd like to support the show and let me know how much you are inspired by these conversations and how much you look forward to hearing the uplifting stories from my guests, go to patreon.com/bebold. Patreon supporters get to submit questions for me to ask guests and become part of our private Facebook group. And that is ladies only. They also get access to bonus content, including questions I ask of the guest. To keep up with me, you can connect with me by friending me on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram at both Beth Witt Wah and at WanderGal. Feel free to leave a message or question at 877-280-5170. I really, really, really appreciate feedback. You can email me at beth@shesboldpodcast.com. And, let me know if you have suggestions for future guests or topics. It's been a little bit easier for me to record these days because I'm doing it over Zoom, so the guests can be anywhere. Normally, I'd have to be in their city or they would have to be in Seattle. So let me know if you've got somebody on your mind that you'd like me to chat with. Ladies, you can join the Be Bold Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Be Bold group for support and encouragement for whatever ways you're trying to be bold. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. And until next time, be bold.